Well, Russia's escalation of the crisis over Ukraine has brought a flood of condemnation from Western leaders. President Putin's decision to recognise two breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine as independent states has also prompted punitive sanctions. The toughest at this stage is likely to be Germany's decision to halt the key Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project. This has been built to bring Russian gas to Europe, but still needs the go-ahead from German regulators, which Chancellor Scholz now says has been suspended indefinitely.
This pipeline was set to bring Russian natural gas straight to Germany's doorstep via the Baltic Sea. Now the Nord Stream 2 project has become a tool in Germany's efforts to punish Russia's aggression in Ukraine. After President Putin recognized the two separatist regions in the country's east as independent states. I have asked the German Economy Ministry today to withdraw the report on the analysis of energy supply guarantees from the German energy regulator. It sounds technical, but it's the required procedure, so there can be no certification of the pipeline now. Without this certification, Nord Stream 2 can't become operational. Scholz's announcement is just part of broader efforts to sanction Russia over its latest move. EU ministers met on Tuesday morning to discuss joint measures, with European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen announcing via Twitter that a first package of sanctions would be put together by day's end. But for now, the halting of the pipeline remains the most significant step taken in response to Russia's latest escalation.
Let's get more on the German response then from DW's chief political editor, Michaela Küfner. Welcome, Michaela. So finally, Chancellor Scholz has uttered the words Nord Stream 2 and done something.
Absolutely. He's pulled the plug on it. He will smother that project in German bureaucracy, which is a sure way to keep it from going online for a pretty long time. He's making it subject to a new energy strategic analysis, so that will take some time. And clearly, he also said that what just happened will play a huge role in that. Translated, that means Russia clearly is not to be trusted. And what does that mean in European and German energy security? He so tried to avoid saying Nord Stream 2. Even when he was standing next to Joe Biden, the US president, he wouldn't say it outright, even when Biden said he would ensure that this project does not go ahead if Russia crosses that border. And that's because not mentioning it was his entry ticket into talks. He went to Moscow last week. I was able to go with him on that trip. There he also was still trying to avoid going too deep in the issue of Nord Stream 2, which is so important for Russia. And now to no avail. He's pulled the plug on it for now, for sure.
So lots of criticism of the Chancellor for his reluctance to discuss it specifically. But as you say, it's important to Russia, but it's also important to Germany as well. So it's quite a brave decision.
Yes and no. Actually, the full capacity of Nord Stream 2, that first pipeline that is connecting Russia directly with Germany, it's not actually on full throttle capacity. The real issue is that the storage here in Germany and Europe was low, and that Russia is only delivering by the book. It is not delivering anything. It doesn't absolutely have to by contract. And this is really the big question, whether Europe can afford to spend a winter without more Russian gas. Will Russia now stick to its contracts? But we've heard from Brussels that the EU, for now, is confident that, yes, it can. But we're also already hearing there are big fears, and consumers will feel this in Europe, that energy prices will go through the roof.
So over the last few weeks and indeed months, we've seen all this diplomacy, international heads of government going in and out of the Kremlin. It appears to have been for nothing.
It appears so. It didn't stop what certainly Washington is now calling an outright invasion. The US is now using that term. The big question is, can it still be contained in some shape or form? And how hard are these sanctions going to be that are now drawn up? There seems to be a sense, I was at the Munich Security Conference this weekend, the Americans were already going a step further. There are also quite a few members of Congress, particularly from the Republicans, who'd called for sanctions, preemptive sanctions, to avoid Vladimir Putin even taking it this far. So I think there will be a lot of soul-searching done whether sanctions shouldn't have started earlier. They are arriving now. They did not deliver in the sense of avoiding a full-on escalation. And the big question now is how much longer Kyiv will hold out, not giving Russia a pretext for open fighting.
Meanwhile, we've had lots of Western allies, that Germany, the EU, NATO, all saying that they're standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, yet Vladimir Putin does seem to have outmanoeuvred them all.
Well, it was kind of predictable that when the EU, when the US say they stand side by side with Ukraine, and this is also something the Ukrainian President Zelensky criticized at the Munich Security Conference, it's words, it's economic support. Some are delivering weapons, some NATO countries, but what he said he really needed were security guarantees, ideally a timeline to join NATO. Now, him joining NATO, his country joining NATO, wasn't on the cards anyway, because since the annexation of Crimea, it doesn't fulfill the legal requirement even to join NATO. It already has a conflict. NATO does not import conflicts into what is a defence pact. But he really wanted more, and he knew he was not going to get that. So when it comes down to it, he's pretty much on his own, although we're already hearing talk of Britain, for instance, delivering more weapons. They call them defensive weapons, but in the end, you can have a legal argument. Where's the difference?
OK. Michaela Küfner, DW's chief political editor, thank you. Well, Poland is preparing for the possibility of mass arrivals of refugees from neighbouring Ukraine. The Polish government says up to 1 million displaced people could seek shelter and is setting up reception centres. Some Ukrainians are already making their way into the country.
After a 10-hour drive from Kyiv, Irina Gawryliaka is ready to unpack her suitcases at this monastery in the Polish city of Przemysl. It's just 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. She came here with her 2 daughters, as well as her brother and sister. Irina doesn't want her children to experience the horrors of war.
I received a message from my daughter's school. It said the basement was ready with running water, food, toys, and blankets. The children could be safe there for 5 days if anything happened. That's when I realized how serious the situation is.
Irina's worried about an attack by Russian troops, so she sought shelter at the monastery. At first, they plan to stay a week, hoping that it will be possible to return home soon. The city has a school for its Ukrainian minority. If Russia does invade Ukraine, Irina will be able to register her daughters at the school. The school's principal, Piotr Pipka, and all the teachers here speak both Polish and Ukrainian. It would definitely be easy to communicate with these children. And I think it would certainly be a substitute for their homeland. Thousands of Ukrainians live in Przemysl, and over 1 million now live in Poland. Many fled to their western neighbor after war broke out in Donbass, and so far they've been welcome as mostly low-wage workers. The new wave of migrants has led to mixed reactions, especially due to their history of conflict. They killed us before. I have no love for them, but if they need help, we have to help them.
Everyone's afraid of this war because we don't know what impact it will have. It could lead to an influx of migrants to Poland and other countries. I wouldn't offer them a room, but I'd give them some food. I live alone, so I'd be afraid. I often go to the Ukrainian dentist because his prices are good and I've never been disappointed. But I can't say today whether I'll help them.
Irina Gawryliaka hopes there won't be war or a wave of refugees. She views her own trip to Poland as a type of life insurance.
We buy health insurance or car insurance, and hope we don't need it. Coming here is like insurance for our children. But we really hope that we don't need this insurance.
But now Irina intends to stay in Poland until she is certain that it's safe to return home.
Well, let's explore that issue with Radoslaw Sikorski, who's a former Polish foreign minister and is now a member of the European Parliament. Welcome to DW. Should the EU be following Poland's lead and preparing to take in Ukrainian refugees as this Russian invasion becomes more likely?
I'll answer your question, but let me just correct what the previous speaker said. It's not true that you can't extend NATO membership to a divided country. After all, when Germany joined NATO, Germany was a divided country. The real reason is that whereas others were prepared to go to war with Russia to defend West Germany, we are not prepared to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. And that's why Ukraine may have to be fighting alone.
All right, well, on that point, do you believe that we'll deal with that and then we'll come to my question, since you answered a different question, but it's quite interesting. So do you believe that NATO should admit Ukraine now and then go to war on its behalf?
It's a red herring raised
by... Well, it's your red herring.
Vladimir. Yes, it is. I was at the NATO summit in 2008 when Ukraine applied, and the application was rejected. And nothing has happened since then to bring Ukraine even an inch closer to membership. And moreover, the Chancellor of Germany said that on his watch, he would veto such a membership.
OK, so that's clear.
That's not... The issue is that President Putin wants Ukraine. He doesn't regard Ukraine as an independent country.
Right. And I wonder, as a former Soviet satellite state, I wonder how threatened Poland feels about these latest moves.
Well, we feel about it the same West Germans felt about being on the front line during the Cold War. It's not a good thing to be on the front line. You live in fear. You know, today's Germany is in the luckiest geopolitical position in its history, surrounded exclusively by friends and allies. Whereas we, Poland, are on the borders of Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. And two of our neighbors might soon be at war with each other. Not a good place to be in, I agree.
Right, so just to be clear, you regard Poland as being on the front line of any future conflict with Russia?
Well, remember, there are Russian troops in Belarus, and they are threatening Kiev from Belarus. So 3 of our neighbors, half of our entire border, is composed of countries which might be fighting one another soon.
After months of avoiding the subject, Olaf Scholz has today stopped the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project with Russia. Your country has been demanding this for a long time. Are you satisfied with this German response?
Yes, at last. I was warning about it as early as 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. This was a piece of economic selfishness that ignored the geopolitical interest of the entire European Union and of our part of the European Union in particular. And I hope that people who sank 10 billion euros into this project, literally sank it in the sea, now get a lesson for their greed.
Thank you so much for joining us. I think you've made your position very clear. Radoslaw Sikorski, member of the European Parliament and former Polish foreign minister.
Thank you.
More on the German position then from Ralf Stegner, who is a member of the German Parliament for Chancellor Scholz's Social Democrats. He also sits on the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to DW. Who will the Chancellor's decision to halt Nord Stream 2 hurt more, Russia or Germany?
Well, it is part of the sanctions that were agreed upon with our allies, and the aim is to hurt the Russian side and to let them think over what they did yesterday and come back to the diplomatic table and respect international law that doesn't go without getting hurt ourselves. Everybody knows.
Right. Do you expect what do you think will halt President Putin's advance? What will make him reverse this decision? Because this isn't going to do it, is it?
Well, no, but we have seen that the only possibility we have is to talk on diplomatic terms and to react with economic sanctions, that he sees that he doesn't have anything to gain with his actions. There is no military solution to the problem, and therefore we have to have patience in terms of our diplomatic efforts. And as long as we stick together with our allies in the European Union and with our transatlantic partners, the chances are good. When we divide ourselves, we have more problems to reach anything.
Ukraine wants Germany to do more than just shutting down Nord Stream. It wants Germany to send weapons as well, which the German government has said that it will not do. Should it reconsider that position?
No, not at all. If you say that there is no military solution to the problem, then I don't think it's the right way to send weapons into the tension region. And besides, Germany's role hasn't been to send weapons into tension regions anyway. And on the other hand, we have supported the Ukraine more than any other country has in terms of economic help, in terms of political support. And I don't think there's any good in sending weapons into the region. Ukraine cannot win a military conflict with the Russians, and Europe should not seek a military conflict by any means.
Right. So when Ukraine says what it wants from Germany is not just warm words, but weapon as well, you say Germany knows better.
No, I would say we support you very much, as you could see, by billions of economic aid we have given to the Ukraine, and by standing close together with the allies in terms of the sanction package we just put together to bring Russia to come back to the negotiation table.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, Ralf Stegner, Social Democrat member of the German Parliament.
Thank you.
Well, President Putin has described Russia's presence in eastern Ukraine as a peacekeeping mission. Ukraine's president says his country will not give up territory and is calling for international support. Western governments have condemned Russia's recognition of the breakaway territories and dismissed Mr. Putin's peacekeeping claim as a pretext to invade the rest of Ukraine. Unmarked military vehicles have already been seen in the east.
Troops mobilize in the dead of night. Early on Tuesday, columns of military vehicles were spotted approaching the outskirts of Donetsk, the capital of one of two separatist regions of eastern Ukraine. While no insignia were visible, the vehicles appeared just hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered Russian troops to deploy. The move represents a significant escalation, but Moscow is calling it a peacekeeping operation. Only hours before, Putin recognized the separatist regions as independent states. It was a historic moment. With just a few strokes of his pen, Russia's leader made a diplomatic solution to the crisis more difficult than ever.
As for those who have seized power in Kiev and are holding on to it, we demand that they stop military operations immediately. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of bloodshed will be fully on their conscience.
On the streets of rebel-held Donetsk, a small group of people was seen celebrating the announcement. Ukraine's president called an emergency session of his Security Council and made a renewed plea for tough sanctions on Moscow.
We expect clear and effective support from our partners. We'll now look closely to see who our true friends and partners are, and who will continue to try and scare off the Russian Federation with mere words.
Ukraine says it will not give up its territories and accuses Russia of tearing up the Minsk roadmap to peace.
Let's take you to the Ukraine then, where we join DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kiev. Welcome, Nick. What have you been hearing from Donetsk and Luhansk?
Well, definitely the situation there is very tense. It has been for the past few days, a real uptick in fighting there, taking the locals back to the worst times in that Donbass conflict in 2014, 2015. Thousands of people without water, without power because of damage to critical infrastructure, soldiers being killed and civilians wounded. Lots of images of people in bomb shelters hiding. Some now thinking about whether it's time to leave that frontline zone and move a bit further away from those front lines. But obviously the biggest fear that we'll see Russia not only sending its troops to those rebel-held areas, the thing that began yesterday night, but also that we would see them crossing the front line because those separatist areas claim basically the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, most of which are under government control, under Kiev's control. And if they make good on that promise, that would obviously see huge amounts of fighting and lots of people, lots of civilians involved in what are very densely populated areas.
Tell us more about how Ukrainians are reacting to this latest move by Russia.
Well, I think there was huge shock at that speech by Vladimir Putin yesterday, which was basically an hour-long tirade about historical injustices he says Russia has suffered not only from the West since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also prior to that by the communists. He said basically Lenin had created Ukraine in its present form, that basically everything that Ukraine has in the way of industry in terms of resources was all down to Russian and Soviet investment in Ukraine, that basically if Ukraine wants to leave Russia's sphere of influence, it needs to give all that up and basically become a fully independent state on a much smaller part of its current territory. Crazily unexpected little elements about talking about water prices for domestic households in Ukraine, talking about various factories that had gone bankrupt. So kind of extraordinary that the President of Russia feels the need to talk about these things on the prime time, talking to Russian citizens. And the main focus was his last sentence, which was basically a pretty open threat to Ukraine, that he said that if basically Ukraine doesn't get its troops out of even government-held territory, then any kind of escalation in violence could lead to a much bigger war, and that, he said, would be fully the responsibility of what he called the regime here in Kiev.
Right, and so another fear for the government must therefore be that, well, will it just end at Donetsk and Luhansk? Is this going to lead to something wider across Ukraine?
I think it's a very brave analyst who will try and give you any kind of concrete answer on that. It seems like all the options on the table, and particularly that extraordinary spectacle we had yesterday of Putin with his top security officials in what looked like a kind of strict teacher giving his ministers talking to, and them all having to kind of give their lines and support this decision, looking all pretty nervous, fluffing their lines. So one of the advisors even by mistake talking about annexing these regions rather than recognizing them as independent. So all these options seemingly still on the table. Russia might include Donetsk and Luhansk in its own territory, as it has done with Russia. There's still talk of maybe attempts to try and link Russia proper with annexed Crimea over a land bridge, so taking more Ukrainian territory to be able to get to Crimea. It's a very nervous time here. It doesn't seem like Vladimir Putin has to basically, decide these things in discussion with anyone except his own conscience. This is a man who now believes this is about his historical mission, his place in the history books, and there's obviously a very scary place for Ukrainians to be in now.
Okay, for now, Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thank you so much. Let's think about the wider Russian context then with DW's Russia Affairs analyst, Konstantin Eggert. He joins us from the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Welcome, Konstantin. Even by Mr. Putin's often surprising standards, last night's 65-minute speech was quite a thing.
Yes, it was. I mean, nothing like that in my 30 years of journalism field and nearly 60 years of life. It is incredible that someone of this stature will spend an hour explaining the whole history of the Soviet Union, starting from Lenin, all to deny legitimacy to Ukrainian statehood and to the Ukrainian people. And this statehood was recognized by Russia in 1997 by a so-called Bolshoi Dogovor, the big treaty they call it, in Russia, which also talked about the borders. So there is a recognition, and it was overturned in a matter of 5 seconds, because I think Putin is really, really very serious about Ukraine. I would venture to say it is his number one priority in life, and as Nick Connolly earlier said, in his quest for historical legacy for Russia. And that means that he will not leave Ukraine alone, although maybe he will relent a little bit in these coming days. because I think what he would not have expected, that is my suggestion, being the brave analyst that Nick mentioned. I do not think he expected Germany to freeze Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This was probably something he would have very seriously considered before deciding on this venture in the Donbass.
OK, and the other big question that analysts are perhaps a little bit wary of answering, does it stop there? Is he likely to extend beyond Donetsk and Luhansk into taking Ukraine itself?
I think he wants to. That's very clear. Actually, I think Putin's goal is to have Ukraine completely subservient to Russia, whether as part of Russia, whether as a kind of governorate, whether as a client state. That's details. He definitely wants Ukraine in Russia's fold. Whether he'll be stopped by the current plethora of sanctions remains to be seen. But I think even if he relents for now, I venture to say that he will continue pressuring Ukraine when he thinks the moment is right. The only problem, Phil, is that we don't know which moment Putin considers to be right, because after yesterday's speech, it's very clear his thinking is so vastly different from the thinking of Western leaders he spoke to incessantly over the last 2 months, that pretty much everything is possible. We're living in a very strange world indeed.
I wonder, is Mr. Putin's position inside Russia completely secure? I'm sort of looking forward to the point when sanctions have been introduced and the country is perhaps suffering. Is he likely to face a backlash?
I don't think there's going to be an immediate backlash. But I think that if you compare it to 2014, where there was a real nationwide celebration of the getting back the Crimea, Putin's rating stood at the time close to 85%. And that was a kind of a natural hike in many ways. Today, nothing like that happened. If you saw the shots, the footage from Donetsk or Luhansk of celebrations, this is ridiculous, like 5 people and a dog. I don't think that Russians were taken in by that. It doesn't mean there is a revolution brewing in Russia, but this is something that really doesn't touch that much on the majority of Russian lives. Russians now are concerned with COVID-19, with bad healthcare system, with their survival, with their day-to-day lives, with salaries, with jobs and stuff like that. I think that there's a different context to all that. And if you add to that the fact that Mr. Putin's been around, has been on Russian TV screens for 22 years now, this does not bode well, I would say, if not in the short, then in the midterm. I don't think it is an achievement that can be compared to anything he did before, and that, I think, means trouble in the future, and probably not such a distant future, for the whole of the system he created.
OK, thank you for that, Konstantin. DW Russia Affairs analyst Konstantin Eggert. Well, as we talk about what's going on in Ukraine, many in the country are preparing to defend their homeland. Some are ordinary fathers and mothers. Others are veterans who've already fought against separatists in the east and are determined to resist any further invasion. DW's Fanny Fashar reports now from Ukraine's capital, Kiev.
The instructor is explaining to Ivan how to pull the trigger. He's holding a gun for the first time. Ivan wants to be prepared, he says, in case Russia starts a full-fledged invasion.
I feel responsible for myself, for my family. I have to know how to defend them.
According to recent opinion polls, about half of Ukrainians want to stay and resist, with or without arms, if a war breaks out with Russia. In light of a possible invasion by Russia, these Ukrainians want to let the world know they are not afraid, and they want to be prepared in case their own government is no longer able to provide for their safety. After the violent crackdown of pro-European protests in 2014, gun ranges started to mushroom. Good business for the owner here, but he would prefer it to be for another reason.
I hope this business will continue to bring in a profit, but only with shooting as a sport and not to prepare for a war.
Anton needs to be prepared too. A military veteran, he expects to be recalled any time now to serve at the front line.
No one wants to get back on war. That's if you are mentally normal person. I want to fight so my son will live in a free country. That's very important for me.
It is a difficult time for both Anton and his wife.
Everyone has a choice, and this is his choice.
What choice do I have, actually? To give my son live under slavery of Russians? Well, I'm not saying that they will enslave him, but I understand that he will live in different country. And I want, if it will happen, so he knows that his father made everything, so that won't happen.
Russia has always said it does not plan to invade Ukraine, and there are Ukrainians who still believe that a peaceful solution to this crisis can be found. But as weeks of uncertainties go on, more customers are learning how to shoot and arming themselves. Ivan wants to buy a gun too, but like many clients here, he hopes he will never have to use it.
Well, the UN Security Council has met in emergency session over the crisis. Russia used the meeting to accuse Ukraine of shelling residential areas in the east of the country, while the US ambassador promised new sanctions against Moscow. NATO and a growing number of world leaders have condemned Russia's actions.
President Putin has now violated Ukrainian sovereignty. He's sent troops in. He's broken international law. We will immediately institute a package of economic sanctions, which I think, as people would expect, targeted not just at entities in Donbass, in Lugansk and Donetsk, but in Russia itself, targeting Russian economic interests as hard as we can.
Russia shouldn't underestimate the resolve of the European Union. Vladimir Putin crossed the line yesterday, and there will now be a coordinated response from the Europeans together with the Americans.
Russia's clear attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is unprovoked. It is an attack on Ukraine's status as a UN member state. It violates a basic principle of international law, and it defies our charter. What is more, this move by President Putin is clearly the basis for Russia's attempt to create a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine.
At present, all parties concerned must exercise restraint and avoid any action that may fuel tensions. We welcome and encourage every effort for a diplomatic solution.
Let's get an EU perspective on this crisis now with Reinhard Bütikofer, who's a member of the European Parliament with the Green Party. He coordinates the party's foreign policy in the European Parliament. Welcome to DW, Mr. Bütikofer. As we speak, EU leaders are discussing sanctions against Moscow. What can we expect?
Well, the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Vice President of Commission, Josep Borrell, has proposed tough sanctions, and the debates have shown pro and con. Germany and a couple of other countries have strongly endorsed the line taken by Borrell, but others, I hear, have been trying to water it down. I do still hope that other countries will take an example from the decision that Berlin has just taken to halt the certification of Nord Stream 2. This had been controversial in our country for a long, long time. My party has always opposed Nord Stream 2. Now the government has taken a tough decision, and I hope that the other measures taken will be just as consequential, because we have to not just sanction individuals, we have to sanction banks that are financing Putin's aggression. We have to make sure that Russian corruption and Russian money laundering in the EU will finally be dealt with in a stringent way. There are so many measures that we should take. It must reflect a very, very strong conviction that...
Understood, sir. Understood. The time is against us. We understand what you say there. I'm intrigued by this apparent disagreement within EU ranks. We were told before this happened that the EU had a package of very hard-hitting sanctions ready to go. So why is there now this bickering?
Well, you're asking me something that I don't know and stopping me from saying something I do know. So maybe you try with another question then.
All right. How important is Germany, and very good of you, by the way, sir, to just admit that you don't know. We thank you for that. How much of a dent will Germany's halting of Nord Stream be to Russia, do you think? You've said it is significant. How much of a difference will that make?
Well, it signals that Germany is now willing to effectively reduce our gas dependency on Russia. And that's a momentous change. Also, it is of symbolic value because this pipeline had always been applauded as a last tool for a thriving economic relationship between Germany and Russia. And the fact that this now breaks down is clearly signaling that there has been a turning point. These days will be the days of a sea change in German-Russian and European-Russian relations.
As Western governments prepare new sanctions against Russia, European football's governing body, UEFA, is facing criticism for saying it has no plans to move the Champions League final from St. Petersburg. Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed UEFA boss Alexander Sheferin to St. Petersburg after the Russian city was chosen as host 3 years ago. UEFA says it's monitoring the Ukraine situation, but is not planning to change the venue. Chair of the British Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee described the decision as shameful and added that UEFA is providing cover to a violent dictatorship.